As we come to Mark chapter 14, that's the text we'll consider tonight. We will come to the place of Jesus' anguish, and we will consider the difficulties that he experienced as he prepared for the cross. The cross is that moment where he offers atonement for the sins of God's people. In the garden, however, we will see his willingness to surrender, to die for the sins of the world. The story of Gethsemane takes place in Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 52. And so tonight, for our purposes during prayer week, what I want to do is I want to survey the passage with you, and then we're going to come back to Mark's ultimate aim found in one verse in the middle. I'm not going to tell you what it is going through. Let's see if you can find it. But we'll circle back and we'll hit Mark's ultimate purpose and what he intends to emphasize, and then we'll draw lessons about prayer. Tonight, the topic will be the surrender of prayer, the surrender or submission of prayer. And so as we start into our survey, the text begins by emphasizing the overwhelming sorrow and difficulties that Jesus faced in Gethsemane. This sorrow starts in verse 32. So let me read several of these verses to you where you can sense Jesus' sorrow. It says, "And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch.' And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, 'Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will.'" After Jesus celebrates Passover in the upper room, he travels with his disciples to a place on the Mount of Olives. They do not go back to their normal residency in Bethany because during Passover, they're required to stay within the city limits of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives is within the city limits. The text tells us that they go to a garden called Gethsemane, and in case you were wondering, the word Gethsemane means olive in Aramaic, or olive press. Apparently, this garden contained an orchard of olive trees and had an olive press for processing them. Now, once in the garden, they're going to spend the night there. He leaves disciples behind him at two locations. He first leaves the 12 behind him in one place, goes with Peter, James, and John a little farther into the garden, and then he leaves those three, Peter, James, and John, and he goes by himself so he can pray to God in this significant moment. Now, in verses 32 through 36, verses I just read to you, I think Mark emphasizes over and over again the overwhelming sorrow of Jesus. Okay, and let me just point out a few of these to you. So in your Bible, in verse 33, okay, in the middle of the verse, it says that he began to be greatly distressed and troubled. Language here is vivid and describes the great anxiety and distress that was coming down upon Jesus suddenly at this moment. Then in verse 34, look in verse 34, he says, "My soul is very sorrowful." So he's explaining to the three what's going on. He says, "My soul, my whole inner being is very sorrowful." He's very sad. The word sorrow or sadness here is also strong and vivid. It's not the normal word even for sorrow that you can use. There's a prefix on the front of it. It's the word peri. Okay, meaning that he's sorrowful all the way through or all around in his soul. We use the English word perimeter, right? The whole way around. All through his soul, he's experiencing great sorrow. It's so great that in a parallel gospel, Luke, the gospel writer, tells us that there were great drops of sweat, like blood dropping from his his head during this time. He's experiencing great sorrow. Third, in Mark's gospel, he continues in verse 34. He says that his sorrow is even unto death. Do you see that in your Bible, verse 34? Okay, I'm not making this up. This is how Jesus describes it. He says, I have so much sorrow in this moment, I feel like I'm just about ready to die. Jesus almost dies in the garden. Of course, it's not where he makes atonement for sins. He does it on the cross. But in this moment, as he's preparing himself for this, he says he feels like he's ready to die. Finally, we can see Jesus' overwhelming sorrow in the way that he prays. Mark has Jesus departing from the inner three at one moment, verse 34 again, and it says that he throws himself on the ground. Okay, this is, he casts himself down, or it could be he collapses. This is not the normal way to describe someone in prayer in the New Testament. You see, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is overwhelmed by great anguish and sorrow of soul, so he collapses in solitude and he prays to his Father. That prayer posture of Jesus shows us he's facing overwhelming sadness. I tell you, men and women, no man has ever faced anguish of soul as great as this. No man. Perhaps you've experienced great anguish of soul. Jesus is experiencing overwhelming sorrow. But not only overwhelming sorrow in Gethsemane, he also faces overwhelming ignorance and opposition. And the rest of the passage in our survey will show how people kind of heap on and add to the sorrow of soul that he's already experiencing. And guess where this starts? This starts with his three closest friends, Peter, James, and John, the inner circle, when they ignore the real things that are going on for Jesus here. Look at verse 37. And he came and he found them sleeping. He said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again, he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. So as Jesus struggles here for the souls of men in the garden, as he pours out his heart in prayer to God, his closest friends sleep soundly a short distance away. Here Jesus is surrounded at this point only by 3 of his disciples, and some might wonder why these 3? Why does Jesus have his conversation with these 3? Why did they fail in this way? And I think I have a suggestion for you. It's very interesting as you read Mark's gospel that in the chapters previous to this, it was these 3 who had declared their utmost loyalty to identify with Jesus and be with him. So flip over just a little bit in your Bible and let's hear from James and John, Mark 10, 38 through 40. So look there real quick, Mark 10, 38 through 40. And we'll see James and John and their commitments to be with Jesus. Jesus said to them, Mark 10:38, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink or to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized? And they said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to him, the cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I'm baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand and on my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those who have been prepared. Here in this text, and it's a complex passage, James and John say that they can indeed bear through the same sort of future that Jesus himself is going to face. That's what all that baptism language is about. It's a metaphor, it's a picture. Jesus is asking them, do you think you can go through the same thing that I'm just about ready to go through? And their answer is, we're able. We got this. I think what we're going to see with their failure in the garden is that they're not able. They're not able, at least at that moment. And then flip forward to Mark 14. Mark 14, back to close to the passage that we're looking at this evening. Mark 14, I want you to consider the words of Simon Peter in verse 29. And for sake of time, I'll just also read verse 31. Peter said to him, "Even though they all fall away, I will not." Verse 31, but he said emphatically, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." How does that go for Peter later? Jesus also gives these inner three a reason to pray. They must pray so that they themselves do not succumb to temptation. You see, their drowsiness at this crucial moment is due to their failure to realize how critical this time in the garden is. Had they only known that in just a few hours or in just a few minutes, they would face the greatest test of their Christian faith, perhaps they would have prayed. How often are we like this, though? Okay. We are all very vulnerable as fallen sinners. We do not have strength in ourselves. How often we as well should remember these things and go to the Lord in prayer. But I want to keep our focus on Jesus. Jesus faces great ignorance, insensitivity, and opposition from others in the garden. This insensitivity comes from his closest friends, but next we'll see he's betrayed by another acquaintance, an insider. Look at verse 43. It says, "And immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, 'The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard.' And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, 'Rabbi,' and he kissed him." And so Judas, one of the 12, as he's often described in the Gospels, betrays Jesus during this dark night in the garden. Because of the darkness in the garden, Judas had prearranged. He says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Jesus, the people are with him, and I'm going to give him a kiss. And you'll know that he is the man that you want. What an ironic act of betrayal, right? A kiss from a friend. Have you ever been betrayed by a friend before? A close friend? He or she mocked you, or criticized you, or slandered you, or hurt you. Do you recognize the betrayal of Jesus here is so significant, though? It ends with an arrest, a trial, and his death. I'm trying to capture what Jesus is going through in the garden. He's facing overwhelming disappointments. He's overwhelmed in sorrow. He's neglected by the insensitivity of his close friends and then betrayed by an insider, by an apparent act of affection. But it doesn't stop here. Next, he's seized by a mob of people. Look at verses 46 through 49. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to him, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but let the scriptures be fulfilled." Here Mark describes the act done to Jesus here with a strong verb. He repeats it 4 times here. I don't know if you picked that up. It's the word seize. Seized. It's in verse 44 and 46, 49, and 51. This means he was apprehended, or even more strongly, he was taken a hold of. The word seized is a good way to translate this. An angry mob of people clutched onto him, seized him, grabbed him. Okay. But his sorrow and affliction is not quite finished. Verses 50 through 52, the end of this passage, we'll learn the final act here in the garden is he's abandoned by everyone, all of his followers. Look at verse 50. And they all left him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, and he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Wow, now that's the way. We're not expecting it to end that way, right? Okay. The key to understanding these final comments is the verbs left and fled. Everyone is leaving and fleeing. The word left is used in verse 50 and verse 52. The word fled is in verse 50 and is translated ran away, but it's the same word in verse 52. Everyone is leaving and fleeing. It starts with all of the remaining disciples. They should have been praying. They should have been praying for this great moment that they have to stand with Jesus, but they all run away. And yet there's this one young man, right, who lasts a little bit longer than the rest. We don't know who this man is. Some people actually think it's John Mark, that he puts himself in the story because he really was there. We don't know for sure. If it is John Mark, he's really good at running away when things get difficult. But I do think this is an allusion to an Old Testament prophecy. You could write down this text, look it up sometime. It's Amos 2, verse 16. Amos 2, verse 16. I'll read you a portion of it. It says, in that day, even the valiant will flee away naked. One man describes, he says, the prophecy of Amos has come to pass among all of Jesus' followers. Even the bravest of warriors will flee away naked on that day. But I think this is a tribute to the aloneness, the isolation that Jesus faces here when even the last brave young man by his side chooses to flee away in naked shame instead of staying with Jesus. You get this? It's the way Mark describes this. It's like a decision he's got between two things. I either go that way and I'll be naked in front of all these people, or I stay with Jesus. I'm going that way. So all around Jesus is chaos and betrayal and abandonment. That's the story of Gethsemane, okay? Yet, somehow, Jesus carries on and departs with the mob to begin the events of his formal arrest and crucifixion. That should leave us all with one question here this evening, and that question is how? How in the world was Christ able to face overwhelming sorrow and ignorance and abandonment? How was he able to remain steady in the midst of this great affliction? And that leads to my final point, Mark's main emphasis in the text. In verse 36, Mark shows that Jesus steadied himself in this text not by his reliance on close friends and insiders, but through prayer. Look with me at verse 36. Going back to verse 36. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. We have seen Jesus in prayer in the Gospel of Mark on 3 occasions. But this one is a little bit different because we're given a very brief window into what he's praying and into the nature of his relationship with his Father. Verse 36 is so important for us. I want to draw your attention to a few important aspects of this verse. First, notice the closeness between Jesus and the Father. Jesus calls out to God in this moment, revealing the closeness of his relationship. He says, Abba, Father. Jesus had isolated himself from every other form of help or distraction in the quietness of the garden, and he prays out to the Father. One gets the impression that times of prayer like this were frequent in Jesus' life, revealing his unflinching commitment to spend time with his Father in prayer. Of course, you've probably heard preaching on Abba, Father before. That's also found in Romans. It's amazing to me that the Apostle Paul would use this title to talk about how all believers can cry out to God. He says, but you have not received the spirit of adoption, or you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. Very affectionate term for Jesus. In the quietness of the garden, he starts, Abba, Father. Notice Jesus' unflinching belief in the power of God. I said on Sunday, I said one of the things we got to leave with this week is to just know God can. He can do it. And here in verse 35, Mark's kind of narrating what Jesus is about ready to do. And Mark says that he describes that Jesus is going to pray if it is possible for God to remove the cup from him. But notice how Jesus prays in verse 36. Abba, Father, all things are possible with you. Okay, so what is Jesus' view about whether God could do something about this? God can do anything to help him. Jesus' unflinching belief in the power of the Father. But then third, notice the freedom Jesus enjoys in prayer. We can see Jesus' freedom in prayer most clearly in his strong request when he says in verse 36, remove this cup from me. Now, do you recognize, first of all, that's an imperative. That's an imperative. Jesus here looks upon the cup that he's about ready to drink on the cross. Not in the garden, on the cross. I think the cup here is a metaphor for the fact that all of the consequences for the world's sin throughout all time will be laid upon him. This cup is the cup, according to the Old Testament, of the unmixed wrath of God against sin. Jesus in the garden realizes that the sins of God's people are going to be placed upon him, and because of that, God's holy, hot wrath, unmixed with any ounces of love or mercy, are going to be poured on him. He realizes all the sins and disobedience of God's people will be poured upon his soul, and as a result, he will face all the divine wrath and judgment of God upon their sins. It took millions or billions of people's eternities of wrath as the sin bearer upon himself. That's what he's considering in the garden. That's what's going to happen in the next few days on the cross. Matter of fact, Isaiah, the prophet, looks ahead to the cross and what Jesus is going to face in Isaiah 53. You remember these verses? It says, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord, listen to this, and the Lord, that's God, and God has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Just a few weeks ago, I was preaching in our church, and I preached on this passage, and I came to the word laid. And it's very interesting. Normally, this word in Hebrew means something like to meet. And so a good way of understanding this is that every iniquity and sin and transgression from all of God's people meet at this one horrific spot on this one innocent man. Think about that. All of the lusts, the anger, the selfishness, the arrogance, all of the murder and adulterous thoughts and actions, all the greed, every act of slander and gossip and deceit. Everything came down on this one man. And then Isaiah says at that time, it was the will of God to crush him with his holy, just wrath upon sin. This thought in the garden is so daunting to Jesus that it's his own testimony that he almost died at the thought of it. Can you imagine Jesus here crying out? Another way. Another way. Abba, Abba, Father, another way. Is there another way? But guess what happens next? He submits himself to God in prayer. And he finds new resolve to stand and to face all the forces of hell against sin. I want you to notice the submission of Jesus' personal desire to the Father. Verse 36, the way that verse ends, he says, "Yet not what I will, but what you will." Here we come to a collision of wills that reveals the humanity of Jesus. And it is not uncommon for us to have a will that is different than God's. But what do we do when we have a collision of wills with God? Our will versus his will. Jesus shows us here. To Jesus' prayer for intervention, his will, remove this cup from me. He adds a prayer of submission. Not my will, but your will be done. Through this moment of looking at Jesus in the garden, I want to tell you, brothers and sisters, we've got a great example to follow. Jesus steadied himself as he poured out his desire to the Father and then submitted. As we close, I ask you, what painful choice are you facing today? Is it your life calling or life pursuit? You fear that God is calling you to some difficult calling or some difficult place, and so you resist it. Or is it the question of a future life partner? Is it your will against God's will? Are you facing difficulties of choice on whether to stand with integrity at work against immoral or dishonest practices there? Is it your physical health? And will you, in these moments, say, not my will, but yours be done? Will you surrender to the will of your Father today and be steadied to face the challenges of your life? In this passage, I have tried to paint a very brief picture using Mark's words of everything Jesus went through. Betrayal, deep anguish of soul, physical trials, spiritual trials, and we have done this to see the submission of prayer. This commitment from you will bring steadiness in the trial too. This is the submission of prayer.